All right. It's the top of the hour, and I want to welcome everyone who has just arrived, who's watching us on Facebook, and who's in the audience on Zoom. Happy Earth Day, everyone. We're so glad you're here. I'm Angela Fobbs, the chair of the Global Black Caucus.
And I'm Hesse, and I chair the Global Women's Caucus. Welcome to our Earth Day webinar.
And we're going to hand it over to Julia Bryant, our global chair, and she'll get us started.
Thank you so much, Angela and Anne, for putting together what's been an amazing day of conversations and activities. I hope everybody who's on the call has had a chance to join in before this. Our next speaker is our keynote speaker for the day, Christiana Figueres. Secretary Figueres was the executive secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change during the Obama administration, and we're thrilled to have her with us today. Thank you so much to Kathy Rothschild for arranging this. She's our own regional vice chair for the Americas, and she's going to introduce the secretary. Kathy, ready to take it away? Go ahead, Kathy. Do you want me to unmute?
Thank you, Julia.
Oh,
welcome. It's an honor for me to introduce Christiana Figueres. She will be speaking to us about her new book, The Future We Choose. Between the years 2020 and 2030, the choices we make will determine the future of the planet that our children and theirs will inhabit. I know all of you are deeply interested to hear what she has to say. Most of you have read her bio or will be inspired to after you hear. Listing all her achievements and contributions in the field of climate change would take up all the time she has to speak with us. So I'll simply say, she is my hero. She gives me hope and the inspiration for activism. So on behalf of Democrats Abroad and the entire virtual audience, let me warmly welcome you, Doña Christiana, and thank you for gracing us with your presence.
There we go, successfully unmuted myself. Thank you very much, Kathy. Thank you for that introduction. And you said we want to hear from everyone. We also want to hear from your dog. Clearly, that little dog also has an opinion. And honestly, I just think that all of us working from home has so much more humanized the work that we do, because when we are isolating in work mode, not at home, there's only sort of a part of our humanness that goes to the office or goes to these meetings. And so I've just enjoyed all of this dog bombing and children bombing and noise bombing that is going on Zoom. It just makes things actually much more representative of our real life. So having said all of that, Kathy, thank you very much. And let me just say that were I still a United Nations employee, I definitely would not step into an election of a single country, especially not a country that is not my own. However, I am no longer with the UN. And in fact, I must say, even as a former UN official, I would really hesitate to step into anything that is national elections, except that this time, the US election has huge ramifications, not just for the United States, but for the world. And so that is why I have justified it to myself to make a very, very important exception to step into a conversation that has to do with a domestic election. So let me start from there, Kathy. Let me start from why does this election that is coming up in the United States, why does it have a huge international ramification? And then I will also go out on very thin ice and just summarize what I'm sure all of you know, which are the impacts internally in the United States. But let me start with the international. Kathy, as you well said, we have just published a book, The Future We Choose, in which we explain why it is the next 10 years that are going to define the quality of life on this planet for centuries to come. That is no exaggeration. I am a Latin American woman, and we're very often accused of exaggerating things. This, however, is no exaggeration. This is science, very, very clearly stating that whatever we do on greenhouse gas emissions over the next 10 years will determine whether we have any possibility to get on track with climate change or not. In fact, by 2030, we have to be at 1/2 the emissions that we have today. By 2030, cut down our emissions by 50%. Of course, we have never done that as humanity, and yet it is what we are called to do in order to be able to get on to the curve of emission reductions that takes us to a safe level of zero net emissions by 2050. But if by 2030 we're not at half, then we can kiss goodbye all efforts that have been made up until now to be able to address climate change. Now, the scary thing that is happening is that those 10 years that remain the 10 years to half emissions, those 10 years have sort of gone into somewhat of a time warp, if I may say so, because the recovery packages that in the United States are already, as of yesterday, up to $3 trillion, but that worldwide will go up to $10 or $20 trillion. Those recovery packages will substantially determine what kind of an economy we have this decade. And it is this decade in which we have to get on track with a low carbon economy. So while we thought that we could work at this over the next 10 years, here is the voice of alarm. It is over the next 3 to 18 months, falling certainly into the next administration, that we are going to determine where the economy goes and whether, of course, we can deal with coronavirus, but also whether we can use that same fresh capital injection that is going in to kickstart the economy after the paralysis that we're seeing, after the thousands of people that have been tragically lost to us, after millions of people have lost their jobs, their livelihoods, their only incomes. After all of that, we will have to reinvigorate the economy, and that's going to be defined by these recovery packages. Not that we have to add any more capital to them, but we certainly have to be very vigilant about the design of those packages. If those packages go to high carbon assets, high carbon industries, without any green strings attached, we will kiss goodbye to anything that we have done on climate change up until now. If those recovery packages are packages that go to kickstart the economy, but to reset and to build back better, a cleaner economy, a safer economy, a more equal economy, then we will have been able to reap the benefits of a silver lining of this very, very painful crisis that we are in. Now, that is true across the world. It is particularly true in the United States. And yes, the design of many of those recovery packages will be done between now and January, but there is substantial redesign and still new decisions that can and will be taken after January. In the meantime, it is very important for everyone in the United States to be very clear advocates for the responsibility that we all share on ensuring that those packages are packages that are addressing all the issues that we have, certainly the health issue, certainly the climate issue, and certainly the inequality issue. And if there is any opportunity and any responsibility in this crisis, it is precisely to understand that those crises, the health crisis, the climate crisis, and the inequality crisis have collided against each other. But what that actually means is that that collision opens up the possibility to converge the solutions. And we have to be advocates for that between now and January. And then hopefully after January, we will have a much more open ear to that. Now, it is true, as I said, for the world, it is particularly true of the United States because like it or not, most countries take a look at what the United States is doing and in order to decide what they will do. But it is also critical because the United States plays a very critical role in the governance of all international and multilateral organizations. The fact that there was efforts to build a very interesting recovery package at the International Monetary Fund that had all of these guardrails included it, and that then the United States stopped them, is really completely unacceptable and irresponsible. And so what is done on these issues between now and January is key, and we should advocate for that, but also we need to ensure that after January, we have a very, very different leadership in the White House, and I don't need to convince you about that. Because the world does need that decarbonization to be married with the health crisis, and the United States sits on very important levers of those decisions. Moving from the international to the domestic, I need not tell you what is under attack and what has been under attack for the past 3.5 years. The fact that democratic governance has been under attack, the fact that checks and balances have been weakened, that transparency and accountability of governance has been severely weakened and questioned. The fact that the social contract that we all thought we had has basically been thrown out the window, and that there is more inequality in the United States now, starting with a very unfair and unjust health system from which the United States is really suffering right now because the health system that exists is not capable of dealing with this pandemic. Parenthesis, I am a Costa Rican. I'm speaking to you from Costa Rica. Costa Rica is a tiny developing nation, but that has a strong health system that has been able to beautifully manage this pandemic. There is no excuse that an economy the size of the United States does not have a decent health system that guarantees health protection to every one of its citizens. The fact that science has been under attack. I remember going right after the inauguration of Mr. Trump, I remember going on the Science March in Washington, D.C., because we were also outraged at the fact that science was under attack, and science has continued to be under attack. And just so that we don't forget that humor is also part of our fight here. I do remember my very favorite sign in that Science March was being held up by a gentleman who could easily have been in his late 70s or early 80s. And he held a sign that said, "Things are so bad that even us introverts are coming out to the streets." And things have gotten even worse after that. So the fact that science is under attack, the fact that truth is under attack, I mean, it is just a unreal world when truth is no longer stands for truth. And from my perspective, the fact that international cooperation is now so underfunded and so vilified, when we know that all global challenges require global solutions, and that no citizen in the United States is safe unless the global challenges are actually addressed. If we have one person with this virus anywhere in the world, we're all threatened. These mental and mythical walls that are being built up do not protect anyone, because global issues are global. And we're all sitting in the same boat. If there is a boat with a hole in it, it is just not true that it's only the people sitting around the hole that are going to drown. We all drown. So we have to work for a world in which we are all safe together through international cooperation. Now, I told you that I'm a Costa Rican citizen, so I did spend quite a bit of time in the United States and love the country, not its current leadership, but love the country. And I can't tell you how sad and how angry it makes me that the United States, because of the leadership that has been there now for 3.5 years, the United States is frankly simply not taken very seriously on any issue that is worthwhile. The fact that the United States has made has built out a ridiculous role for itself in most of these issues makes me very sad, and I'm sure makes you irate. We have to rescue the values and principles that we stand for within the United States, and we have to rescue the reputation of the United States abroad. So that is why, obviously, you're doing the good work that you're doing. Getting the vote out from abroad, but I would also like to remind you that it is critical for you to help get the vote out domestically for those who are inside the United States. So think about it in 2 geographies, everybody's spread outside of the United States, but also please do use your networks, your families, your friends, your tribes that are in your networks to ensure that you are helping to get the vote out also of those citizens who are living in the United States. With that, let me pause on my comments, and happy to have a conversation with you, although I should warn you that because I work on global issues at the global level, if you have questions domestically about domestic policies in the United States, I probably am not the best address for that, but I will do my best.
Thank you so much. First of all, we really appreciate you taking the time to get online with us and talk to us. Kathy, do you want to start with the first question? Or I can go with the first question. Your choice. And I will unmute you. There you go.
Eventually, we will all be very prolific in these technologies, but we're all still learning.
It's true. It's so true.
Okay. Yes, I hear that you have are co-hosting a blog. I'd like to hear more about that.
Yeah, we co-host a podcast. It's entitled Outrage and Optimism. I think it speaks to both feelings that you all harbor. There is every day a lot of things that cause the outrage in us, but we also feel that it is important through this outrage and anger to maintain an optimism, and an optimism that is not naive, that doesn't pretend that things are going to take care of themselves, but rather quite to the contrary, an optimism that is infused with the understanding and the science in particular of everything that we are facing, and that because of the understanding of science, we can actually muster everything that it takes collectively to address issues, whether they be climate or whether they be the health pandemic. So in that spirit, our podcast, Outrage and Optimism, it focuses mostly on climate change, but we go through climate from many different perspectives, we hear from artists, from politicians. Recently had John Kerry on the podcast. We hear from scientists such as David Attenborough and Bill Nye. We hear from Jane Fonda is coming on our podcast very soon. So we have a huge selection of people who come to the climate from very different perspectives, and whose sense falls somewhere in that range between outrage and optimism. But mostly they have at least a bit of each, and it's a pretty lively conversation. So I highly recommend it, Outrage and Optimism, wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Fantastic. And again, the name of that podcast is Outrage and Optimism, for everyone who's asking on the chat. That's fantastic. So we have a question from in our Q&A box. from someone named Brittany. She says, I study REDD plus in indigenous communities in Costa Rica and want to know what the funding negotiation looks like after the failure of the last COP and the cancellation of this year's COP. Thank you so much.
Yeah, well, first of all, this COP26 hasn't been canceled, it has been delayed. Very important distinction there. And yes, it is very true that one, or in fact, the one important topic that has been left pending, in fact, since 2015, has been the carbon market. Sadly, that's still been pending. And it would have been one of the topics that would have been in the middle of the conversation at COP26. It was in the middle of the conversation of COP25 and did not reach a resolution. The fact that COP26 has been delayed into next year, of course, gives us more space and more time to deal with this. But in the meantime, I should say that I'm quite excited about the fact that all of the different organizations, academic institutions, experts that have been working on both the environmental and the social guardrails for nature-based solutions have actually come to an agreement that we will be publishing as early as next week on the 4 principles that need to imbue any nature-based solution for climate and for biodiversity, both on the supply side and on the demand side. So I think that these 4 principles that will be made public next week. We wanted to do it this week, but there's just so much going on Earth Day, and happy Earth Day to everyone. How did we not start there? So much going on that we decided to delay for next week. But my sense is that if those principles take hold, if they really root, and everyone can increasingly agree to them, that will be very important preparatory work for an agreement on the markets and on offsets for next year. So yes, it's too bad that COP26 is not happening this year, but in the meantime, we can use the work to do much of the heavy lifting.
Well, fantastic.
We have a question in the chat box, if I could ask that.
Go ahead.
Bruce from Austria asks, if a Democratic president is elected in 2020, what can the president do to repair the US reputation in the global community? I'm especially interested in climate change policy and the possibility of joining the EU Commission in support of the Green New Deal.
Yes.
What can you say, Bruce, there?
Yes, you have basically answered your own question. Obviously, if a Democrat is elected in November, I am pretty certain that one of the first things that would be done by executive decree is to rejoin the Paris Agreement, because that can be done by executive decree. It's the United States will withdraw by executive decree at the end of this year, and rejoining can be done. In the meantime, I should say that there are many states, especially on the 2 coastlines, and 300 cities and hundreds of corporations and academic institutions in the United States that have continued to decarbonize, because from an economic and financial point of view, they know that it's beneficial to them. And they're not bought into this ideology myth, but B, because they are preparing the ground for the United States to be able to dovetail back into the Paris Agreement. So, kudos to all of those stakeholders who are preparing the ground for the United States to dock back in to the Paris Agreement. So that obviously is one big piece. To repair the relationships with all international organizations. Honestly, the healing process that needs to occur there with every single one of the international organizations is going to require a pretty brave and hardworking Secretary of State to go back into all of those international institutions and repair the damage that has been done. And then, of course, domestically, all the rollback that has been done on previously EPA-led regulations, whether it is on federal lands and drilling, whether it is on CAFE standards, whether it is on emissions, whether it is on SOx and NOx. I mean, everything that has been rolled back is going to have to be rolled back in. And that requires a very strong and hardworking EPA administrator. So, honestly, we need not just a president that brings sanity back into the White House, but we also need a very, very hardworking cabinet to accompany the president. There is hardly any sector in the United States that hasn't suffered tremendously in the past 3.5 years, and that is going to be a shared responsibility, not just of the president and vice president, but every single top level administrator. And then it's going to trickle down all the way down to every single civil servant. So, in advance, my admiration for the new team, for the repair work that they're going to have to do.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And we've been able to talk to many of the presidential candidates throughout the last few months, and it was inspiring to hear how strong so many of them are on environmental policy, and hopefully we're going to see some of these in the cabinet as well. So I think we have some good people to look forward to, good leadership. We've all been introduced to them, and I think I have some hope for that. Our next question is from someone named Carmen Pang from our Q&A box, and they ask, what scientific advances do you think are the most useful for reducing carbon?
Well, fortunately, there are many options for reducing carbon, and I would classify them into two buckets. One has to do with energy, and other has to do with nature-based solutions. On the energy side, you will all be happy to know that even the United States is installing more renewable energy this year and last year than fossil fuel energy. Why? Because renewable energies are simply more competitive in the United States, as well as in India, for example, as well as in Chile, certainly, and in many other countries where renewable energies, because the cost has come down 80% over the past 8 years, then it's just no longer an ideological discussion. It's simply which is the best investment. In addition to the fact that which is the best investment short term, but also which is the best investment long term, because you don't want to throw good money after bad into investments that are already becoming stranded. So renewable energy, absolutely. One piece on the energy that is constantly forgotten is energy efficiency. And having lived in the United States, I have to tell you how inefficient is the energy use in the United States. It's pathetic. There is more energy consumption per capita in that country than in most of the other industrialized countries, because all of the energy efficiency technologies that are available are simply not being used. And that goes all the way from insulating homes and buildings properly, all the way to smart thermometers inside buildings and movement, light sensors, et cetera, et cetera. So, there is a huge piece to be done, which actually would bring back millions of jobs right now, to get the entire infrastructure of the United States up to snuff with energy efficiency technologies that already exist. We don't even have to invent them. Same thing for renewable energy, right? Millions of jobs that would be created there. Beyond that, the infrastructure of the United States, I don't have to tell you, especially the electricity infrastructure, but also the road infrastructure, is pathetically old. And so renewing that infrastructure such that, in particularly from the energy sector, that whatever is generated is smartly, intelligently used, is also contributes to bringing down emissions, but also contributes to millions of jobs. And fourthly, I would say all of those are technologies that exist. We don't have to invent anything. We don't have to invest in new technologies. It all exists. The other piece that is not quite up to market is everything to do with carbon capture and storage, in particular industrial capture, or in fact capture from the air. So there are technologies that are being developed that capture CO2 from the air and store them. And those technologies would be very interesting from a climate perspective. They are not necessarily ready to go. They're not shovel ready. And they wouldn't produce millions of jobs immediately, which I think is going to have to be the priority. So that's everything to do with energy. Then there is another bucket that has to do with land use. And agriculture in the United States is a very important sector, in particular in the middle of the country, where Democrats have a much harder time getting votes. And it is just unbelievable that agriculture in the United States is actually not even catching up with 21st century technologies. Farmers can be so much more efficient, both in their crops, in their production of crops, in their gathering of crops, in the way that they distribute their produce, and through doing all of that, they can reduce emissions. So there's a huge role to be played by farmers and agricultural practitioners in the United States to have much better harvests, higher quality, and a higher scale of harvest, and contribute to the reduction of emissions. So, you know, a huge plethora there of technologies that are available and that create jobs and are all shovel ready.
Sounds like such good plans, good news. Let's just hope that we can put them in place. I have a question for you from Heather Thomas, and she asks this: can I just ask who the we is who shall be publishing the 4 principles mentioned? I missed it. Very exciting and tremendously useful. Where can I find them? Thanks so much.
Yes,
Heather.
the we, yes, Heather, thank you. It's a very important question. In fact, as soon as I get off the line with you, I'm going on another Zoom call with the we, with the team that is doing these 4 principles. And it's going to be unbranded because there's no one single institution that is behind this. That is the exciting part about it. It actually is a very large collection of institutions that are coming behind this, and that is the strength of it, that it is not one institution or one NGO that is putting these forward, but rather it is the result of year-long efforts of many different institutions that have been working in parallel with each other, but that have now come together to say, okay, you know, we agree on these 4 broad principles, and underneath that, of course, there's going to be a lot of flexibility for case-specific application of those principles. But the 4 principles are going to be, are being agreed to. So unfortunately, I can't tell you yet where it's going to be published because that is still in negotiation. But I would say by the end of next week, if you Google NBS, Nature-Based Solutions, 4 principles, I'm sure Miss Google will direct you to where that's going to be.
Well, thank you so much. Do you have time for one more question?
Sure.
So it's a good question regarding where the climate discussions are evolving. That's from Anelika Andrade. She says, how do you see the climate discussions evolving in light of COVID-19? Do you see climate adaptation and resilience going up in the agenda?
Yes, what a good question, because, you know, we tend to focus climate on mitigation measures, as I've just gone through with you, and we tend to forget the importance of resilience and adaptation. Now, most of the land-based solutions are both mitigation and resilience and capture of carbon in the soil. So they play both roles. But I actually suspect, and we can all follow this to see where this goes, that that one of the big learnings that we're going to have from the current health crisis is the huge importance of resilience, the huge importance of resilience, of our institutional resilience, of our personal health resilience, of our policy measure resilience, of our financial resilience. I think, we have never been as tested in the brittle nature of our response capacity that includes everything that I've just mentioned. We're sort of standing there, like the emperor without clothes in front of ourselves, in front of public opinion, where all of a sudden we have to admit that we are not a very resilient society. How were we not prepared for something like this? And as epidemiologists have said, this is not even a terrible virus. This is a mild virus. And look what it has caused, because we are not resilient. And so resilience, I am hoping, praying, I have all my little lights on that altar, that this is going to be one of the big mega lessons, that we have to invest in resilience across the board, institutionally, financially, economically, technologically, socially, from a nature perspective. We have to invest in resilience, because this is not the last global crisis we're going to be living in. We will be hit with many global crises as we move forward into the century, because now it's very difficult to have crises that you can actually isolate into one country or one region. They very quickly become global because of what we've done on interconnectedness and globalization. So resilience, hopefully the mega lesson from this.
Thank you so much. We so very much appreciate your time. Thank you, Kathy, for organizing this and for joining us so that you could be the keynote speaker for this all-day webinar. We've had a great time, and we really appreciate your time. Please come back and speak to us another time. It would be really a delight.
Thank you very much. Go vote.
We will. Appreciate it.
Thank you for your time.
Bye.
Bye. Back to you, Angela.
Okay. Wow.